reminds us of the capacity of human beings to commit great evil. Sometimes we can tolerate and stand by great evil even as we think that we're doing good.
The Portuguese arrived at the Gold Coast in 1471 and were the first European nation to do so. They originally chose to go to the Gold Coast because of its abundance of gold. However, they later switched to trading slaves as there was a greater demand for slave labor in the New World as plantations were growing. Portuguese built their first trading post in 1482 and it was called the Almena Castle. They built it in order to protect themselves from other European competitors as well as aggressive Africans. The west coast of Africa quickly became a major source of slaves for the New World and began attracting all European nations who sought control over such a profitable trade. Portuguese maintained control over the Gold Coast for about a century, but during the 17th and 18th century, more and more European nations began building forts on the Gold Coast and therefore created a great deal of competition. The Dutch overtook the Almena Castle and the Portuguese left the Gold Coast for good. The Dutch and British remained as the most powerful nations on the Gold Coast until the British overtook the Dutch in the late 19th century. British now had total control. In 1807, import of slaves to the colonies were abolished by Britain, and they began to exploit other products such as palm oil, gold, timber, and cocoa. In 1833, slavery was officially abolished in all British colonies. Slave trade truly boomed in the 18th century, and an estimated 6.3 million slaves were shipped from West Africa to the Americas, and in total, 12 to 20 million slaves were transported across the Atlantic. Throughout the 18th century, the Gold Coast supplied 12.1% of total Atlantic trade. Not only did European nations profit off the slave trade, but a lot of leaders in Africa were involved and benefited as well. The slave trade created competition of expansion within African communities. Essentially, slave trade dominated commercial activity. Slaves were treated brutally, and up to 2/3 died before being shipped off to the New World. Slaves in Africa were given limited rights, but were often accepted into their masters' families. On the other hand, in the New World, they were treated very differently. In 1863, Britain controlled the entire region, making it a crown colony of Britain. However, on March 6, 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan colony in Africa to gain independence. Ghana had a promising economy because of rich natural resources. They were a leading cocoa exporter, producing 1/10 of the world's gold, and 25% of the population could read, and many had an education. Although Ghana experienced a period of corruption in the government and a poor economy, it was able to survive and become a successful model of a democratic government in Africa. It is often looked at as a model of economic and political reform in Africa. Ghana has, for the most part, been able to avoid civil obstacles, and compared to other countries in Africa, Ghana has advanced industrial production and is an extremely important peacekeeping partner. Currently, the nation's leading trades are gold and cocoa. However, in 2007, a major oil discovery was made, which will make Ghana one of the leading oil producers within the next 5 years.
Citizens of the new state of Ghana gather for the celebration marking their Day of Freedom from colonialism. What was once the Gold Coast, a British colony, now becomes an independent Commonwealth. Vice President and Mrs. Nixon represent the United States at the three-day festivities. Native dances and games mark an event of historic importance since Ghana becomes the first Negro colony in Africa to gain its freedom.
Liberia, or what soon was to become Liberia, was invaded by the Mains tribe during the 16th century. The Vai people also migrated there after their empire collapsed. The Kru, who were natives of the area, joined with the Mains against the Vai, as they did not support the migration of the Vai into their region. The Kru soon became involved with European trade, and later, specifically the slave trade. During the 16th century, both the Dutch and the British set up trading posts in the Cape Mont region. Liberia was founded in 1821 as a result of the end of the transatlantic slave trade by former slaves from the U.S. Also, due to efforts of the American Colonization Society, which was an organization created in 1816 that advocated for the colonization of free blacks in Africa. America was scared that the freed slaves would revolt, so they used the organization to persuade them that they would live a better life in Africa. Some people see the slave trade as something that civilized Africa. Economic reasons behind ending slavery was that the new markets were needed because of the spread of an industrial revolution. Americans thought that freed blacks should go back to Africa in order to obtain their greatest potential, and also that black Christians would be able to spread Christianity in Africa as well. This also led to the founding of Liberia. In the 1840s and 1850s, the population began to grow in the new nation, and by 1870 there were 13,000 people living there from the U.S. However, life in Liberia was extremely tough and many people died because of disease. There was a rising tension between the natives and foreigners, and in 1847 the Republic of Liberia became independent of the Americo-Liberians. The Republic created a government based on the U.S. government and modeled their constitution by the U.S. as well. But even though it was democratic, it was not truly run this way. Some people believe that the formation of Liberia was actually not a success when looking at what the United States had originally hoped for the nation. By the 1940s, there was no public education, no water running through pipes, no roads, or a system of electricity. And because of the constant fighting between the natives and settlers, the nation was not able to develop a stable economy. Basically, it was inevitable that Liberia would enter into a civil war, considering the accumulation of conflicts. For the most part, Liberia was pretty settled until the 1980s, when the government and economy essentially collapsed and civil war broke out. More than 200,000 people died and millions were placed into refugee camps. And in 1995, a peace treaty was signed and Mr. Taylor was elected president. However, he was accused of corruption and exiled to Nigeria in 2003. During its civil war, along with the 200,000 people that were killed, thousands fled the country in order to avoid the war. The war left the country in ruins. The majority of the population cannot read and are unemployed. Even the capital of the country lacks running water and electricity. 15,000 peacekeepers are in place in Liberia, and after facing 14 years of civil war, their economy has crumbled to the ground. Because the nation has suffered decades of an unstable government and economy, it will take a huge effort for it to recover anytime soon. Liberia right now is one of the poorest countries in the world. However, some argue that had the transatlantic slave trade not led to freed blacks returning to Liberia, the Civil War is said to have been possibly avoided.
Killings have never stopped. The mayhem has never stopped. The country is going downhill. It's ruined. The economy is ruined. Everything is just, it's just taking a backward turn.